Have you ever wondered why some people always seem to be trying to change, but stay exactly the same? Is the problem a lack of willpower? Or is there something much deeper going on behind the scenes of the mind? What if I told you that often it's the psyche itself that sabotages any attempt at transformation? That the fear of change is just the tip of the iceberg, and that the real prison isn't in the world out there, but in the hidden layers of the ego? This video will show you why some people never change and how you can avoid falling into this invisible trap. Some people believe that changing is just about making a decision, as if all it took was waking up one day, beating your chest and saying, "From today on, everything will be different." But psychological reality is much more tangled. Resistance to change isn't laziness or lack of willpower. It's an invisible internal force rooted in deep layers of the psyche. The person convinces themselves they're changing, but in reality, they're just reformulating the facade. And here's the problem. A surface change doesn't transform the structure. What happens is, the ego adapts, but doesn't surrender. That's why so many people spend years reading self-help books, taking courses, listening to motivational podcasts, but keep repeating the same patterns. This is what we call psychological stagnation disguised as progress. True change requires confrontation, and the psyche doesn't like confrontations. It prefers what's familiar, even if it hurts. Jung said that often we don't change because we don't want to give up what we think we are. So we change clothes, but keep the same skin, impregnated with conditioning, fears, and wounds. The problem is that this facade transformation ends up being socially validated. Friends applaud, social media applauds, the world believes. But inside, everything remains. Unconscious self-sabotage disguises itself as evolution. And the more the person tries to convince others they've changed, the further they move away from what really needs to be touched. Inner transformation, the kind that disorganizes before reorganizing, keeps waiting in silence. And that's when the persona, that social mask so seductive, begins to show its true power. There's a trap that almost no one notices, confusing who you are with the character you play. The persona is that social mask we use to be accepted, loved, recognized. So far, so good. It serves a purpose. The problem starts when the mask sticks to the face, when the person forgets that it's just a role. And then, any attempt at inner transformation starts to seem dangerous. After all, if they change, who will they be? How will others react? Will they still be loved? This attachment to the image we project is one of the great drivers of resistance to change. Because truly changing means risking losing the applause. It's messing with the structure of a self that spent years being molded to fit in the world. And for many people, the fear of disappointing is greater than the desire to be authentic. So they keep the script, say what's expected, behave as taught, smile on the outside while silencing on the inside. And all this might even work for a while. But there comes a moment when the soul starts to scream. When that scream echoes, discomfort comes, that feeling of living a life that isn't yours. And that's when Jung's shadow starts giving signals. Because what was repressed, desires, fears, emotions, didn't disappear. It was just hidden behind the persona. A classic example, someone who was always the strong one in the family but is exhausted and can't stand pretending anymore. If they break this role, they feel guilt. If they don't break it, they get sick. And in the middle of all this, a question that starts to bother arises. What am I avoiding facing within myself? There's a part of us that doesn't appear in the mirror, but that moves us all the time. Jung called this the shadow, everything we repress, deny, or judge in ourselves. And here's the paradox. The more we resist looking at it, the more dominated we are by it. Resistance to change often begins with the fear of facing this darkness. After all, it's much easier to keep focusing on others, blame the past, or even escape to empty spiritualities than to face what pulses hidden inside. Inner transformation requires courage to enter this basement of the soul. It's not about becoming someone better, but about becoming whole. But this hurts, because the shadow guards what we were taught to hide: anger, envy, fear, desire, things the persona doesn't accept, that the ego rejects, but that keep acting between the lines. Unconscious self-sabotage is born exactly from this repression. The person thinks they're in control, but who's driving is everything they refuse to feel. Have you seen people who keep getting involved with the same type of toxic relationship, even swearing they want peace, or who always sabotage new opportunities as if something inside said, "You don't deserve it"? These are clear examples of Jung's shadow acting behind the curtain. And what's curious is that the psyche itself creates mechanisms to keep this part hidden, so as not to disorganize the ego's fragile balance. But there comes a time when the weight of this repression overflows, and when that happens, comes the fear of facing chaos. Many people say they want to change, until they realize the emotional price of that change. Because truly transforming is like opening a box locked for years and discovering that inside there's not just light. There are screams, pain, forgotten memories. Inner transformation inevitably passes through a certain level of disorder, and most people aren't prepared for this. They want the new, but without disorganizing the old. But there's no rebirth without symbolic death. And then fear appears, strong, paralyzing, silent. This is the moment when the person chooses, often without realizing, keep pretending everything's fine or dive into chaos. The problem is that known suffering offers an illusion of security. The mind says, it's better to stay here, where I already know how it hurts, than to enter an emotional territory that might hurt even more. And that's when psychological stagnation settles in like a cocoon. The person lives but doesn't move, breathes but doesn't transform, dreams but doesn't act. Life becomes a loop of unrealized desires. I knew a woman who said she wanted to change careers for 10 years. She had talent, ideas, opportunities, but never took the step. She would say, "I don't know why I freeze up so much." Deep down, it was fear of change, pure and raw. The internal chaos that would arise from breaking with the image of stable professional was greater than the desire to live the new. And so, she stayed there, smiling on LinkedIn and crying on her pillow. But the fragile ego, the one that successfully disguises suffering, still had more tricks to use. The ego is, by definition, a delicate construction. It feeds on certainties and images that make it feel safe. When change knocks on the door, the ego shrinks and raises defenses like invisible walls. This protection is the root of unconscious self-sabotage. The person even desires the new, but creates internal barriers that prevent progress. Repetitions of old habits, subtle denials, elaborate justifications, all to preserve what's familiar, even if it's toxic or limiting. This attachment to the fragile ego works like a psychological trap. Imagine a tree that refuses to drop its dry leaves in autumn, even knowing they block light and growth. The ego wants to stay intact, but thus prevents inner transformation. The fear of dissolving the self is so great that the person prefers to hide behind masks and justifications. It's that famous phrase, "better the known than the uncertain." But this known can be a silent prison. Think of that friend who never admits their mistakes, who always blames others, who avoids changes even when everything is crumbling. It's the ego saying, "I can't lose control." This behavior is often a reflection of deep resistance to metamorphosis. Behind pride hides a gigantic fear, the fear of real change, of chaos, of symbolic death. And the ego clings to this like a castaway to a piece of wood, even if that piece is slowly sinking. For Jung, suffering was a passage, a path to the soul. But there's a hidden danger there, when pain stops being a process and becomes identity. Many people cling to suffering like someone clings to an old blanket, even if it's torn, worn out, and too heavy. This attachment creates a cycle where psychological stagnation feeds on its own pain, becoming a familiar and safe territory, however paradoxical it may seem. It's common to see someone who complains about life, who dramatizes every event, but who deep down can't or won't leave that place. Unconscious self-sabotage appears here with force. The person sabotages opportunities, relationships, changes, all to maintain recognizable pain. The shadow Jung described isn't just what we reject, but also what we choose to keep because it seems comfortable, even if destructive. It's an emotional addiction disguised as martyrdom. A real example is that person who, even in toxic relationships, insists on justifying their partner's behavior instead of seeking their own well-being, or who prefers to complain about their job but won't allow themselves to risk a new path. The fear of uncertainty is so great that known suffering becomes refuge. It's a cruel paradox. Pain secures, pain protects, but also paralyzes and prevents the soul's call from being answered. The human mind is an expert at creating stories to protect itself. Self-deception is a powerful tool the psyche uses to maintain apparent stability, even if psychological stagnation dominates inside. The person convinces themselves they're doing their best, that they can't change now, that life is just like that. These are sophisticated justifications, internal speeches that shield against the discomfort of truth. This cycle generates a kind of illusory comfort zone where suffering is rationalized and even valued as merit. Resistance to change finds fertile ground in this internal narrative. It's common to hear phrases like, "I already tried and it didn't work," "I'm not made for this," or "this is my reality." The persona reinforces this convenient version and the ego accepts it with relief, since this way it doesn't have to face the chaos of transformation. But the longer the person stays trapped in this cycle, the further they distance themselves from their real potential. Jung's shadow remains hidden, and unconscious self-sabotage strengthens between the lines of thought. The paradox is that, although it seems rational, this self-deception is the soul's greatest prison. The next step requires recognizing this cycle and facing the soul's call that insists, even if in silence. Unresolved traumas function like ice in the flow of inner life. They're deep fissures that freeze parts of being, preventing true transformation from happening. Psychological stagnation is often the result of this immobility caused by the fear of reliving old pains. And even as time passes, these wounds remain alive, blocking the path to emotional freedom and self-knowledge. When someone avoids looking at these traumas, they're practically resisting real change. The mind creates defense mechanisms to protect the fragile ego, but these defenses also create invisible prisons. It's like trying to grow in a house with locked windows. Little light enters, air is lacking, and the environment becomes heavy. Jung warns us that without reintegrating these frozen parts, any effort at inner transformation will be superficial and temporary. Real examples appear in people who repeat destructive patterns without understanding their origin. Maybe someone who carries family traumas, experiences of rejection or abandonment, and who unknowingly remains trapped in limiting archetypal roles, like the victim or the sufferer. These archetypes function like chains that make the soul's call difficult, which always invites beyond pain toward true rebirth. Inside each person exist invisible patterns that shape repetitive and limiting behaviors. These are archetypes, universal figures Jung identified as collective psychic structures. Some of these archetypes act like true emotional prisons: the sufferer, the savior, the victim. They define life scripts that seem comfortable even if they lead to psychological stagnation. The person believes they're in their place, but in reality, they're repeating old roles that block transformation. This archetypal comfort zone creates false security, where resistance to change is fed by fear of the unknown. Imagine an actor who memorized a role they know by heart. Even making mistakes seems difficult. Changing this script is like trying to reinvent a story that's been told 1,000 times. And this scares, because inner transformation implies leaving behind old scripts, often loaded with unresolved traumas, that reinforce these limiting archetypes. A classic example is that person who always takes on the savior role in relationships, even if it costs their own happiness, or who stays in the victim position, blaming the world and paralyzing their own growth. These archetypes, though unconscious, shape behavior and worldview. They're like invisible chains that block the soul's call, that silent invitation to free oneself and live fully. The soul has its voice, but it whispers. Often its call is discreet, almost imperceptible, but constant. Those who resist this invitation live in repetition, in the tiring cycle of the same story, the same pain. Jung called this resistance neurosis of destiny, an invisible imprisonment that prevents true transformation. Psychological stagnation isn't mere chance. It's the direct reflection of rejecting this call. Denying the inner call is preferring the safety of old wounds to facing the unknown. It's like closing your eyes to the rising sun, choosing to sleep in a dark room. Resistance to change strengthens, and the ego creates justifications to maintain the illusion of control. Even if the soul begs for renewal, the person sinks into limiting roles and archetypes, freezing their capacity to evolve and expand. Think of that moment when an inner voice tries to alert about the need for change, whether it's a job, a relationship, a habit. Ignoring this voice might seem more comfortable in the short term, but in the long run, this rejection feeds unresolved traumas and strengthens the shadow. Inner transformation, then, becomes a silenced urgency, a suffocated desire that only grows in silence. Truly changing is a kind of symbolic death. It's leaving behind parts of the ego, beliefs, and habits that no longer serve. This passage is essential for any inner transformation, but it's also one of the greatest fears humans face. After all, losing pieces of the known self is facing the unknown, and this disorganizes the psyche, causing intense discomfort. Attachment to the fragile ego makes the person avoid this necessary mourning, preferring psychological stagnation to the temporary void of change. This flight from the natural process ends up creating a cycle of resistance to change, where suffering is prolonged and transformation is postponed indefinitely. What Jung calls psychological death is, in reality, a hidden rebirth, a passage that can open the way to a more authentic and full life. To illustrate, imagine someone who decides to end an old relationship. Deep down, beyond the fear of loneliness, is the terror of losing the identity built around that relationship. This symbolic death might seem scary, but it's the only path for the soul to respond to its call. And when this death is accepted, inner transformation can finally begin, even if there's still resistance along the way. There are moments when resistance to change becomes unsustainable and life comes in with full force, pushing out of the comfort zone. Crises, losses, collapses, these are the most dramatic calls from the soul's call. Inner transformation stops being a choice and becomes an urgent necessity. And then, psychological stagnation is finally confronted head-on, often in a painful and unexpected way. Those who resist for too long end up facing situations that can no longer be ignored. Job loss, the end of a relationship, illness, or even a deep existential crisis can be the final push. Jung said that only those willing to die symbolically can be reborn. And this forced death, though traumatic, can open doors to genuine awakening, real contact with the soul. On the other hand, there are those who, even facing these storms, choose to close their eyes. They remain trapped in the same story, unable to break the chains of unconscious self-sabotage and limiting archetypes. For them, the soul's call remains a whisper, lost in the noise of resistance. But for those who accept the challenge, life offers a unique opportunity for deep transformation and reconnection with themselves. Now that you understand the layers that keep many people trapped in psychological stagnation, it's time to ask yourself, which part within you is resisting the soul's call? What shadows still hide in your psyche, preventing the inner transformation you so desire? Remember, recognizing these barriers is the first step to breaking the cycle of unconscious self-sabotage and fear of change. And you? Are you willing to face the discomfort of internal chaos to live a more authentic and full life? What limiting archetypal roles are you ready to leave behind? The invitation is clear, but only those who accept this challenge can experience true rebirth. If this content touched you, leave your opinion in the comments. Which of these themes resonated most in your journey? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep diving deep into this transformation with us. And before you leave, I invite you to watch this video on the screen, where we explore another powerful key to inner awakening. Let's go together on this journey of change. After all, the soul calls, and only you can answer.